Your rights are my responsibility. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. And I'm not listening to your stupid classes.
Greetings and hello, my name is Bill Roach. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, and today we're going to look at this issue. Has Mike Licona misrepresented J.I. Packer? And you know, a lot of people have been talking about Mike's new book where he's looking at this way of reconciling Bible contradictions in the Gospels. And one of the things that people keep noting, and Mike keeps noting, is that this has really become just a debate over what do we mean by the concept of inerrancy. And for many of you, you realize and you're reminiscing upon the fact that several years ago, in fact, I had somebody recently bring this up to me. They said, are they still sort of fighting and battling this whole issue with sort of the Geisler-Licona debate? And I go, well, Geisler's moved on, but Licona's kept it going. And I guess by extension, I'm keeping it going through making a video like this. But as you remember, Mike put forth a series of comments in his literature over the years. And it started out with, he questioned the resurrection of the saints in Matthew 27, and he used Greco-Roman biography in order to sort of say that this was a non-historical event, that it's merely apocalyptic literature and so forth. And when Dr. Geisler was made aware of it, actually from a student in one of his classes, Norm went through and read the book, and he saw that and other issues in the text itself, and realized that what Mike Licona was doing was exactly what Robert Gundry was doing generations before, namely using genre criticism in order to dehistoricize the biblical text. And, you know, one of the things that Geisler charged Licona with was denying the inerrancy of the Bible, specifically as understood by the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. And, you know, there was sort of a precedent for this because ETS had voted on this issue with Robert Gundry, and Dr. Geisler and others were sort of spearheading this. So when this came up, it was sort of like the Gundry issue 2.0. Now, one of the things that Licona keeps talking about is he keeps saying this whole idea that, you know, there's not a uniform understanding of the Chicago Statement, that he tries to say that Geisler would actually disagree with Packer because Packer gave an approval to Licona's approach. And what I'm arguing for here is that actually what Mike Licona is doing is he's actually misrepresenting not only the ICBI, but J.I. Packer. So what I want to do today is I want to sort of rehash the history of this whole use, maybe the discovery of the real J.I. Packer on this matter. And I also want to look at a few other issues just sort of related to this. Things like, what about the other framers, issues about interpretation, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the things that I want you to see here is that Mike's view really comes down to a few things. One is this issue of what do we do with J.I. Packer? You know, did J.I. Packer endorse it or not? You know, Mike says yes, and Geisler says no. But the other issue is that what would happen if you have the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy and you had Norman Geisler interpreting it one way, saying it's, Licona's views are not reconcilable with it. And then you have J.I. Packer saying, yes, it is compatible with it. Like, what do we do if there is a conflict of interpretation with this? And that's one of the fundamental sort of claims and charges that Mike is saying is that, you got the Chicago Statement, but there's no one interpretation of the Chicago Statement. You got a whole variety of interpretations, even amongst the framers. Now, I think this raises a few questions as it relates to the Chicago Statement and this issue of interpretation of texts in particular. So first of all, I think what people need to realize is that really the chief architect of the Chicago Statement, it wasn't Norman Geisler or J.I. Packer. It was actually R.C. Sproul. And what I think a lot of people forget to recognize is that when you look at the history of how this was laid out, the inerrancy debates were taking place within the Ligonier Academy. And one of the things that R.C. Sproul was doing is he was going around, and it was really sort of initially a Presbyterian debate. And you had guys like Bonson and Gerstner and Sproul and, James Montgomery Boyce and others giving all of these debates on this. And they had actually in a less developed form, the Ligonier statement on biblical inerrancy. But one of the things that they quickly realized is that this needed to be something more than just a Presbyterian issue. And the reason is that it was more than just a Presbyterian issue. This was something that was affecting all of evangelicalism. And, historically, you had the Warfield and Briggs debate where Briggs was calling for limited inspiration, in which you had the dehistoricizing of texts, you didn't have the miracles, you had all these issues related to it. And Warfield responded with full or plenary inspiration. And then sort of like jumping forward to this, if you're looking at sort of the big three I's, you had Briggs calling into question inspiration. You had Fuller Theological Seminary calling into question the historic meaning of infallibility. They actually said, we don't want to affirm the inerrancy of the Bible. We want to affirm the infallibility of the Bible. But what they meant by infallibility was really fallibility. And ironically, when you're getting to this whole Licona debate, he's really trying to redefine the concept of inerrancy, in which inerrancy no longer means inerrancy, it means errancy. So what happened was they gathered a whole collection of people together. And I remember talking to R.C. Sproul directly about this. And he said one of the interesting things is that they wanted to actually have Packer write more of the new articles on this, but he actually never got around to it. So you know who did? R.C. Sproul stayed up all night and penned the full statement on this before they went into committee and worked out and hashed out many of the particular words on this. Now, I'm not trying to deny the role of Packer, nor the role of Geisler, nor the role of anybody. But if we're going to look primarily at the initial primary author of the Chicago statement, it was R.C. Sproul. And how would I know that? He told that to me directly. And what the others did is they met as a committee and they looked at, what are we going to call the organization? They planned out, they did a significant amount of work. And probably the number two in that was Norman Geisler, as measured by the fact that Sproul, gave us the Chicago statement and the official commentary. Geisler gave us the Chicago statement on hermeneutics, worked together with the others, but he wrote the official commentary on this. Now, Packer had a significant role on this, but the point is that Licona's history on this is just a little muddy. And there's a lot of debate and there's a lot of issues that he's trying to bring into this, but there's a lot of details that he's leaving out. But this also raises the issue of, what do you do if, two of these people disagreed on something? And the reality is that, yes, people did disagree even in the committee meetings, but what they didn't disagree about was the statement and the commentaries that were released. But I think the bigger issue is that when you look at the whole issue of the Chicago statement and conflicting interpretations, is it raises an even bigger question, is that does Mike Licona, or really any of these figures, even believe that we can have an objective interpretation of the Chicago statement or any statement in that regard? And the reason I bring that up is that so much of what Mike Licona's sort of sociological approach to using Greco-Roman literature and how it's functioning at that time, and a horizons understanding of how we should approach sort of genre criticism, when you flesh that out in figures like Gadamer and Thistleton and the two horizons approach, namely, you get this whole approach to biblical interpretation, which is really just an aspect of subjectivity. Now, it's not a radical subjectivity, but it's still a subjectivity nonetheless. And, I remember having a conversation, ironically, with one of the people that signed the letter for Mike Licona defending him and all the rest. And one time he said, oh, anybody who believes in the concept of objectivity is ignorant, naive, underread, and all the rest. And interestingly enough, I believe in the concept of objectivity. But it raises the bigger question, is that, is it really an issue of, there's different conflicting interpretations, when ultimately, I don't think Mike Licona thinks there is an official interpretation, not only of the Chicago statement or the Bible, but any text in particular. Now, to some of you, that might, come across as sort of mind-blowing, or to others might be like, well, of course, we can't have an objective interpretation, which obviously that statement's an objective interpretation about how we can't have an objective interpretation. But I remember one of the key books that I read in seminary was titled Objectivity and Biblical Interpretation by Thomas A. Howe. If you leave the A out, it's not the official one that's on there. But Dr. Howe is probably one of the leading experts on this particular topic. And what he does in this book is he surveys, the predominant evangelical and non-evangelical literature on it. And the overwhelming majority of people do not believe in the concept of objectivity. And it's for, historical situatedness or linguistic situatedness or metaphysical situatedness or all of these sociological issues related to a sociology of knowledge or power dynamics or all the rest. There's a variety of reasons to that. So it just really raises the question of how would Mike even deal with the fact if all of them agreed, when the reality is Mike doesn't even agree with an objective understanding of biblical interpretation or the concept of interpretation per se. So I think in one sense, the whole issue of, well, what do you do when two different people have a conflicting interpretation on something is sort of a moot point when you don't think that we can ever adjudicate conflicting interpretations on that matter. So what we have to see here is that when you look at Mike Licona's view, it's very clear that people thought that he was differing with this and that he was actually incompatible with the Chicago statement. In fact, J.I. Packer even said so, and we're going to look at some of those here. But what I want to do here real quick is I want to bring up another quote because, Mike Licona did an interview recently, and one of the guys interviewing him said, well, wouldn't it have been nice if we had a quote from R.C. Sproul? Well, we do have a quote from R.C. Sproul, who was, the president of the ICBI and drafter of the articles. And I know their response, and I'm going to say the response before because I've been seeing it put out by a couple of these people. They're going to say, well, that was before this latest book. But what people are forgetting is that, Mike has not really changed his views. He's merely evolved on his views, in its more sort of latent form. He was already laying this out. And even in its latent form, before he made his more, full and robust declarations, you had the living framers saying that it was incompatible with the Chicago statement then. In fact, one of the things that I kept saying is that one of the biggest differences between Mike Licona and Robert Gundry is that Robert Gundry at least gave us a whole commentary on, the Gospel of Matthew, in which he used Jewish midrash, which raises the other question: is it Jewish midrash or is it Greco-Roman bios? Which one? And the ever-changing ebb and flow of evangelical scholarship in that regard. And Mike really hadn't done that yet. He had given us a few case examples, but he never gave us a fully orbed, laid out case on multiple points of exactly where his view stands. Well, things have changed since then. He's clearly done that since then, and he's clearly made many more statements that have gone even further beyond where he was at that particular time. So one of the things is that, when people level that charge, it's really an argument from the lesser to the greater. If they said that Mike's lesser forms were incompatible, well, clearly then Mike's greater forms would be incompatible also. Also related to this, one of the things that I actually commend Mike for is that at least he's starting to lay out his view. One of the things that people have always said is, we need to update the Chicago statement. Well, you can't update that historical document. It is the historical document. And, I have a whole bunch of videos on here talking about what that would mean and why you shouldn't do it and all the rest. Just go look them up. But one of the things that I actually like about the idea is that at least these figures are going to be clear at where they stand. And Mike has started to do that. So with no further ado, let's look at one of these quotes here by R.C. Sproul. So R.C. Sproul tells us very clearly, and I remember speaking to him about this. I remember discussing the details personally with this. I have literally the physical letter where he made this statement. I have it in my records here, and I listened to the phone call conversations. I had personal phone call conversations with him. So literally, he sent me this particular quote. I have it. R.C. Sproul said this: as the former and only president of the ICBI during its tenure, and as the original framer of the Affirmations and Denials of the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, I can say categorically that Dr. Michael Licona's views are not even remotely compatible with the unified statement of ICBI. That settles it. If proximity to the statement, literally the original framer of the Affirmations and Denials, the chief authority as the president over it in this sense, and he says it's not even remotely compatible. Notice with this, the unified statement on ICBI, meaning that all of the people that put this out were unified on this. So hypothetically, if J.I. Packer departed from this, it was actually Packer who was moving and changing, not Geisler, not Sproul, not the rest in that regard. But it's not just R.C. Sproul who says that Mike Licona's views are not compatible with the Chicago Statement. I want to turn to this real quick. Now, it's funny because we've been talking about this in different venues online, and Lydia McGrew, who has probably done the most work to show the incoherence of Licona's approach. We've been discussing this off and on, not a ton over the years, but back and forth a little bit. And she was reading the interview with Mike Licona, one of the many, and she talks about this. She says, you'll find this interesting. She gives the link below. But notice this quote by Mike Licona. Excuse me. It says this: the concept of inspiration, given the middle knowledge, is that inspired basically means it is ultimately from God, and God has put his stamp of approval on what we have. I would say yes, even any errors that may be in there in that sense is inspired, God breathed. Now, are they inerrant in the Chicago sense? No, they wouldn't be. Are they inerrant in a more flexible inerrancy sense? Yes. So note what he's saying here. In particular, he's saying from the get-go here that his views are incompatible with the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. Isn't that partially what this whole debate was about? Years and years ago, Mike was saying, no, my views are compatible with the inerrancy of the Bible. And Geisler said, no, they are not compatible with the inerrancy of the Bible. Then it came down to this, well, whose definition of inerrancy? Well, you take the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. So now you have the living framers and Mike Licona himself saying that his views are incompatible with the statement. So notice what she goes on to say here. She says this. So there you have it, right out there. Not inspired in a Chicago sense. And we can recall that back when the whole controversy with Geisler was going on, it was about whether Mike himself could affirm inerrancy in the Chicago sense. It wasn't just about whether this particular view of his or that was compatible with the Chicago inerrancy, because he was supposed to be signing on it, or signing on personally, that he personally affirmed inerrancy in the context where the Chicago Statement was in view, namely at Southern Evangelical Seminary. So with that said, notice one of the key things that we have to recognize here is that when Mike was let go from SES, it was because he claimed that his views were compatible with the Chicago Statement, when clearly now he realizes they are not compatible, and other people recognize that they're not incompatible, or the compatible. By logical extension, Mike's views aren't compatible with the understanding of inerrancy that's held at ETS. Do I expect them to enforce that? By no means, because ETS, I think, doesn't even police its own doctrinal statement. But, here's the interesting thing. So let's just raise this and just make it as a supposed idea here. So when Mike says this, that his views aren't compatible with the Chicago Statement, he's actually agreeing now with Norman Geisler that his views are not compatible with the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. In addition, if J.I. Packer thought that Licona's views were compatible with the Chicago Statement on inerrancy, that actually means Licona disagrees with Packer about whether or not Licona's views are actually compatible with the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. You see the conundrum that he's put himself in here? he has now gone from saying that Geisler was wrong to agreeing with Geisler. And if Packer was in fact correct, now you would actually have to say Packer is now incorrect about Licona's views concerning inerrancy. The spice of life, my friends. That's the only way that I can look at this. But again, it comes down to, does it really even matter what Sproul or Packer or Geisler says if Mike's already jettisoned the concept of objectivity and interpretation? Seriously, what difference does it make? Just personal power struggles or personal differences? And the reason I bring this up is that, this became such a big issue, is that I remember Dan Wallace putting this video out. In fact, we need to look at this. We need to pull those back up. And he was talking about how when he was looking at Norman Geisler, and one of the key things about Norman Geisler is that Norman Geisler was affirming the inerrancy of his interpretation of Matthew 27. Namely, he was outright denying the concept of objectivity. And this is just so prevalent all throughout sort of biblical studies today. You can't have an objective interpretation. So, but the whole issue is this. It's really interesting as you interact with like postmodern theorists on this, is that unless you have both a clear objective proposition and a clear objective interpretation of that proposition, then you don't really have meaningful communication. So let's just say hypothetically you have a clear proposition, but you can't ever get to it. Well, then it doesn't matter. Communication's been stifled in that regard. And let's just say, we flesh this out even more. It doesn't even matter unless both of them are put together. And the reason for that is that even if there is this objective world of facts, it doesn't matter unless you can actually get to those objective world of facts. And that's what's so incoherent about the position, is that, these people will ultimately affirm objectivity when you're reading their books saying you cannot have objectivity. In fact, it requires an objective knowledge and an objective communication and an objective interpretation in order to say you can't have objectivity. In fact, one of the things that I had a conversation with somebody about is that what people forget about true postmodernism is that postmodernists are even postmodern about postmodernism. Namely, their concepts are constantly in flux. Now, do I think Licona's there? No. But do I think that he's going down the road of Thistleton and Janine Brown and all the rest? You better believe it, because that's just the prevailing view throughout scholarship in that regard. But with that, I want to turn to a little bit more here, and I want to just look at some of the things that have been said here about, the misuse of J.I. Packer. And, Norman Geisler talked about this. And, for many of you, you can find this, and I'll put the links in the videos here. But notice one of the things is he says this: Mike Licona, this is Norm Geisler writing this, believes there are errors in the Bible, including the day of Jesus's crucifixion, which allegedly is listed on 2 different days in the Gospels. Strangely, Mike Licona and those who support his view have appealed to J.I. Packer to support their view, but Packer has strongly repudiated this view and condemns Licona's position. See below. However, here's one of the key things, and people are going to bring this objection up. Recently, Packer wrote a blurb commending Licona's new book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? Oxford Press, 2017, which defends, among other errors, there being contradictions in the Gospels. This has occasioned some Licona supporters to claim that Packer has changed his view on the topic. In it, Packer wrote a commendation of the book declaring, quote, Professor Licona's new book is a monograph exploring some compositional techniques which the synoptic evangelists appear to have used. Clarificatory and thorough, it is an accomplished piece of work which it is a pleasure to commend, end quote. But notice what Geisler says here. He says this: however, this falls far short of an approval of Licona's denial of inerrancy. Indeed, it claims only that Licona's book clearly and thoroughly, 718 pages, treats certain compositional techniques in the Gospels, and that it in that it does. Now, one of the things that I would say here is that I think the 7:18 actually was a reference to the resurrection book, but it is what it is. However, it does not place approval on Licona's denial of inerrancy. Further, Packer has written dozens of blurbs over the years, even for books containing views which he disagrees with. And that's something we have to recognize here is that, you know, if there's a Guinness Book of World Records about who's written more blurbs for different views, J.I. Packer has won that thing. And Packer has sometimes even endorsed positions that were, you know, views that were incompatible with the Chicago Statement, written a blurb on them, you know, things with theistic evolution and all the rest. And, you know, I have other videos on that because they always try to pull up Packer and theistic evolution and all the rest. However, Geisler goes on to say this: "It was my privilege to work closely with J.I. Packer, not for just a few hours, but for some 10 years, from 79 to 89, in defining and defending the inerrancy of the Bible and the documents of the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy. More recently, January 2017, I updated my conversation with Packer on this topic, and he assured me that he had not changed his views. Quote, as for my specific question as to whether or not he still supported the ICBI statement on inerrancy, he said that rumors to the contrary were categorically and absolutely false. He gave the same answer to my second question as to whether he had changed his view about Licona's view expressed in Packer's letter on 5/18/2014, which declared that Licona's position was contrary to the ICBI statement." So what did he read? The statement reads, as a framer of the ICBI statement on biblical inerrancy, this is J.I. Packer, and once studied Greco-Roman literature at an advanced level, I judge Mike Licona's view that because the Gospels are semi-biographical, details of their narrative may be regarded as legendary and factually erroneous to be both academically and theologically unsound. So right there, you have Geisler, Packer, and R.C. Sproul all saying in very clear terms that it's contrary to the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy. And now, fast forward 15 years, Mike Licona recognizes that. He's finally now admitting that. You know, one of the things that I've talked about is that when you deal with the issue of inerrancy, there's a sociological effect to inerrancy within evangelicalism. It's literally one of the most heated battles within American evangelicalism in particular. And the sociological effect is, these are my people and these are my supporters. And there are real consequences to denying the inerrancy of the Bible within the evangelical world. Mike found that out. And, you know, one of the things that I remember is that, you know, Mike knew this. This didn't come by surprise. Like, people knew what was going on in the conservative resurgence. People knew how SES was, you know, formed and framed around the inerrancy of the Bible. In fact, I know that when Mike Licona was with the North American Mission Board, he flew out to Fort Worth, Texas, and met with J.I. Packer with Paige Patterson. And when he was at Southwestern with Paige Patterson grilled him on this. I've spoken with Paige Patterson about this, and I know for a fact Paige Patterson looked at him and said, Mike, if I believed the things that you believe about the Bible, I would take my Bible and I would throw it out that window and I would stop being a Christian. So Mike knew, given what he had to affirm to work with the North American Mission Board, he knew the history of the conservative resurgence. I think he actually has a poor understanding of the history of the battle for the Bible. I think he just spent a lot of his time looking at other things. For example, you know, he always appeals to, well, that's just one of the many conflicting understandings. What about the Lausanne Conference and their understanding of the Bible? Go read The Great Evangelical Disaster by Francis Schaeffer, in which he talks about what the people there were doing with the Lausanne Conference was one of the specific reasons why they had to have a clarification statement in the Chicago Statement. Namely, it's because they were not actually representing the inerrancy position correctly. You had a lot of British evangelicals who wanted to have a watered down view. In fact, a lot of British evangelicals didn't even want to affirm the inerrancy of the Bible as a concept. They didn't even want to use the word that was related to it. In addition to it, you want to press this a little bit more, the same thing was confirmed and discussed in greater detail in Carl F. H. Henry's magnum opus, God, Revelation, and Authority, and in his biography, Confessions of a Theologian, in which he talks about the exact same thing and why they needed a better, more clear statement, one that actually represented the evangelical view, which was the historic recognized view on inerrancy. So again, Mike, you're just leaving out clear things on this. So let's go back to this. Let's just keep going here. Notice this. Geisler goes on to say, Packer insisted that he strongly stands by both his affirmation of the ICBI statements on inerrancy and that Licona's views were categorically contrary to it. He described Mike's views as muddled and illogical, but wished to keep up the conversation with him in hope that his view would change his position. Upon examination, Packer's more recent book blurb on Licona's book says nothing to the contrary. It is, as stated, a commendation of a comprehensive and clear treatment of certain techniques used by gospel authors, not an approval of everything in the book. Now, notice this. Geisler says, even so, it is well known by scholars that these blurbs often say some positive thing about a book without going into extensive negative critique. Dr. Albert Mohler was more careful when he noted that Licona has admirably defended the resurrection of Christ, but in a way that left the door open to skepticism. Thus, quote, Licona has handed the enemies of the resurrection of Jesus Christ a powerful weapon by denying or undermining the historicity of sections of the Gospels. Indeed, Bart Ehrman used this very opening to deny the resurrection of Christ. He asked how someone could not deny the resurrection of Jesus by the same logic he rejected the resurrection of the Jerusalem saints. In the same passage, Ehrman-Licona dialogue on the historicity of the New Testament gives the dates. So, that said, there are only 3 living framers of the ICBI, Packer, Sproul, and myself, he said. And there's unanimous agreement among us that Licona's view is contrary to the ICBI stand on inerrancy. The original framer of the ICBI statement on inerrancy, R.C. Sproul wrote, and we'll just read it again, because this is a historical record too. As the former and only president of the ICBI during its tenure, and as the original framer of the Affirmations and Denials of the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, I can say categorically that Dr. Michael Licona's views are not even remotely compatible with the unified statement of ICBI. That said, let's keep going here, because I think that there's more that needs to be said. You know, this issue, like we've said, it just keeps coming back. And it keeps coming back. And I feel like I have the moral responsibility, not only to the co-author of my book, but to this case in particular, to say that Mike is readily misinterpreting what J.I. Packer has said. In fact, he is wrongly interpreting him. And we need to just make a clear historical record on this. So let's come back. Let's look at this a little bit more. Another one titled A Response to Misstatements About J.I. Packer's Supposed Support of Licona's Views. So, a letter posted on the internet by Mike Licona supporters reads, I noticed in his Geisler's Point 22, and there's an article, that he disagrees with your statement that the framers of the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy don't always agree on how to interpret the ICBI. Dr. Geisler says there were only 3 living framers of the ICBI, Sproul, Packer, and himself. Then he says, we all agree that Licona's views are not compatible with the ICBI statement. I just wanted you to know that I emailed J.I. Packer last fall and asked him what he thought of your view of Matthew's raised saints. I received this reply from him on the 24th of February, forwarded from David Horn, the academic secretary at Regent College. Dear Johann Erasmus, I apologize for lateness in responding to your email. What Dr. Licona offers is an interpretive hypothesis as to Matthew's meaning. What biblical inerrancy means is that scripture, rightly interpreted, is true and trustworthy. I don't think Licona's guess about Matthew's meaning is plausible, but it is not an inerrancy question. Sincerely, in Christ, J.I. Packer. And people go, see, right there. And I know Licona keeps pressing this. Here's what Geisler said, and I agree with them, and they're probably going to go, of course he did. Unfortunately, the use of this post to support Licona's view is unfounded since it is both false and misleading for the following reasons. First, I did not claim that there were only 3 framers of the ICBI, R.C. Sproul, J.A. Packer, myself. That is false. I have claimed only that there are 3 living framers of the ICBI statements. So far as I know, the others are with the Lord. However, having known their views well, I am sure that they too would support the interpretation of the other framers on this issue. Second, the above web post fails to take note that I did not say Licona's views disagree simply with the ICBI statement on inerrancy, namely the Chicago statement, but with the ICBI statements, plural, on inerrancy, which include the statement on hermeneutics and the official ICBI commentaries on these statements. It is these statements, plural, that make very clear what is implicit in the Chicago statement, namely that Licona's view is incompatible with the ICBI framers' view of inerrancy. Let's keep going here. Third, there's no disagreement among the framers as to the meaning of the ICBI statements with regard to Licona's issues. I called J.I. Packer today about 12 noon Eastern, May 16th, 2012, and he confirmed that it was a misinterpretation of his statement to construe it to mean that Licona had not denied inerrancy. In fact, he affirmed that his statement was only referring to inerrancy in a formal sense, not in a material sense. He said both Robert Gundry and Licona had denied inerrancy in a material, factual sense. For while inerrancy and the historical grammatical interpretation of the Gospels as actual history are formally distinct, yet they are actually inseparable on this matter. The point is that initially Mike didn't come out and say, I deny the inerrancy of the Bible. See, I deny it. In fact, he was trying to very clearly say that he was not doing that. Well, he was practically doing so in a way that fundamentally, and what people have to realize is that you can have a high view of Scripture, but yet the way you handle the biblical text can completely gut that high view of Scripture. So for example, when you look at the Reformation and you look at the main debates of the Reformation, some of the key things, I realized that I left my thing there. Sorry, guys. There's the whole article right there for you. You can go through. My bad. One of the key things that you find is that when you look at the heart of the Reformation, and one of the key things of it is that you have the formal cause and you have the material cause. The formal cause of the Reformation was really sola scriptura, but the material cause was justification by faith alone. What happened to indicate that they didn't believe the exact ideas as it relates to Scripture and tradition happened to be justification by faith alone. It could have been a whole host of other issues. In this sense, Mike Licona's material expression of the resurrection of the saints and now the contradictions issues has similarly indicated that there's a formal difference between Mike and others on what we actually mean by the definition of inerrancy. So just as in the Reformation, we realized by the spark of justification that the bigger issue of authority, the formal cause of it, was sola scriptura. In this sense, Mike, by whatever way he could have done this, it happened to just be the resurrection of the saints, revealed that for years, he had not believed in a formal way the exact view of the inerrancy of the Bible. However, while there's a distinction between these, just like there's a distinction between a formal and a material cause, you can't actually separate them in practice. That said, let's keep going here. And now you can actually follow along with what it's saying. Fourth, Packer and all the framers of the ICBI statements agree that it's contrary to inerrancy in the material sense to dehistoricize the gospel record, not take it as literal space-time history. Consider the following. 1, even in its formal statement on inerrancy, the Chicago statement, there's reference to the grammatical, historical, i.e. literal method of interpreting the Bible, which demands that the gospel narratives be taken in the literal historical manner. 2, in the same article, it condemns dehistoricizing the text of Scripture, which is what Licona does in several New Testament passages, including the raising of the saints in Matthew 27, the angel at the tomb in all 4 Gospels, and the mob falling back at Jesus' claim in John 18. 3, the ICBI framers affirmed a correspondence view of truth, which demands that the affirmation of the gospel record must have a literal referent in the real world, i.e. must be historical. As Sproul put it in the official commentary, though the Bible is indeed redemptive history, it is also redemptive history. And this means that the acts of salvation wrought by God actually occurred in the space-time world. Let's just keep going here for the sake of time. Fifth, to be sure, the ICBI framers did not literally have Licona's view in mind, since he had not yet written his book on the resurrection when the ICBI statements were formed, or his book, Jesus Contradiction, or the book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels and all that. However, as living framers, we are aware that we did have Robert Gundry in mind when we penned the statements. So by extension, these statements also apply properly to Licona as well. For both Gundry and Licona used extra biblical genre determination to deny the historicity of sections of the gospel record. And we also know that Licona holds the same basic view as Gundry did. The only real difference is that Gundry used extra biblical Jewish midrash and Licona used Greco-Roman biography to deny the historicity of the gospels. Both are contrary to the doctrine of inerrancy understood and expressed by the ICBI framers in their statements. This is the same understanding which the members of the Evangelical Theological Society had in 1983 when by an overwhelming 70% vote, they asked Gundry to resign from the organization. And subsequently, ETS members by an 80% vote accepted the ICBI framers' understanding of inerrancy as a guide to understanding the meaning of inerrancy for their society. In addition to this, sixth, Packer not only disagreed with Licona's interpretation of Matthew 27, calling it a guess, that it was not plausible, but he also affirmed in the above stated phone call that Licona's claim that John contradicted the synoptic gospel on the question of which day Jesus was crucified in a debate with Bart Ehrman at Southern Evangelical Seminary in spring of 2009. Now, he's gone much further than this if you read his later literature, but this is clear. This is a clear denial of the inerrancy of Scripture. In view of all this, Packer clearly affirmed his belief that Licona's views are in fact contrary to what the ICBI affirmed about inerrancy. Finally, even if one of the ICBI framers were to disagree with this unanimous interpretation of the living framers, and there is no one, this is hypothetical nonetheless, this would thereby show that Licona's view was somehow orthodox. To conclude that it was orthodox would be to commit the same error that Licona does when he allows external sources and unexpressed intentions to determine the meaning of the text. So the conclusion being drawn by Licona supporters about a division among the ICBI framers on this matter is both false and misleading. Further, the action of asking Gundry to resign from ETS and Affirmations of ETS, the ICBI as the proper guide to interpret the meaning of inerrancy, the largest group of evangelical scholars in the world who affirm inerrancy support our conclusion that the ICBI statements on the matter exclude Licona's view from being consistent with the standard view of inerrancy. In brief, this internet post is false and should be removed. Really, it should be ridiculed. Not only just removed, but ridiculed. It's flat out misinterpretation of the whole issue. So with that said, what do we have to say about Mike Licona's view of J.I. Packer? When you look at the literature and you look at the history of this, he's misrepresenting J.I. Packer, clearly. So as he continues to do more interviews and he continues to, promulgate his views, he needs to just stop using J.I. Packer as somebody that has just said, oh, you're compatible with this view of inerrancy. I think another thing is that Mike's going to act like this idea that, you're either pro rhetorical devices or you're ICBI. And what's really interesting is that the ICBI allows for rhetorical devices to be used within the Gospels. It clearly does. Go read the commentaries. Go read the books by many of these people. And, Mike even recognizes that Geisler even allows for rhetorical devices within his books on contradictions and so on and so forth. But here's the big difference. The ICBI never used a form of rhetorical devices to deny the historicity of the Bible. The ICBI never used a form of rhetorical devices to say that words in Jesus's mouth never actually occurred, or the ICBI never used rhetorical devices to affirm contradictions in the Bible. Because we know this, if A and non-A are incompatible, one of them is either true and the other is false, or both of them are false. Both A and non-A cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. So the point is that Licona's understanding actually is not just an attack on the inerrancy of the Bible, it's an attack on the concept of truth. And it's one of those, God cannot lie. God cannot, speak forth in error in that regard. In fact, one of the key things about the understanding of the new covenant and how covenants operate and should function in the book of Hebrews is the God who cannot lie, the God who cannot communicate falsehood in this regard. In fact, one of the key things you have to look at is that what is Licona's doctrine of God like? I mean, if the material issue of the resurrection of the saints told us Licona's view about Scripture, my goodness, I wonder what Licona's view of God is like. That's actually the more frightening thing to me. Seriously, I'm dead serious. I mean, is he a process theologian at this point? Does he believe that God would do such a thing as communicate error to people? He seems to in his view of inerrancy and inspiration and so forth. So again, there's maybe more questions that need to be answered as we're going forward. But with that said, we can affirm based off of the good work done by the good Dr. Lona-Geisler that J.I. Packer in no way, shape, or form thought Licona's views were compatible with the Chicago Statement. There was no incompatible interpretations of the Chicago Statement amongst the living framers, and he thought that Licona's views were denying the inerrancy of the Bible. If you want more, I'll put all these links in the video description below. Again, thank you.